Everyone seems angry with Ash's fate in the final episode of Roze Recapture, probably because it's the only thing that the fans seem to care about, which is the ship between Sakuya and Ash, despite how underdeveloped it was. Anyways, I thought I would give my take on this. By the way, before I begin, spoiler alert for the entire series. Now, everyone says that Ash's death was avoidable. I agree, and would go even further in suggesting that his death is a symptom of a much larger problem, and that's what's hilarious about this show. Analyze any single issue and reveals a larger one that affects the entire series. When it comes to Ash's death, it goes back to one of my biggest complaints with the series. Roze Recapture is just an unoriginal rehash of the original anime. So when it comes to rehashing the original anime, in this case I am referring to the Zero Requiem. Not only did the series ruin parts of the Zero Requiem, but the writers had the audacity to try and replace it. This is something that I haven't seen anyone else talk about. To be fair, no one talks about this show anyways besides myself and a handful of small YouTubers. But it needs to be discussed as it reveals why the ending is even worse than you realize. Now, this hasn't been, nor will it ever be officially confirmed, but if you analyze what happened in this series, this conclusion isn't far off. This isn't some tinfoil hat conspiracy, as I have facts to back up my claims. Here's what happens in Roze Recapture. Everything Lelouch worked towards in some way or another was ruined. Britannia came back. The UFN failed thanks to Kaguya and Schneizel retiring. Neo Britannia brought back the Democles and the Flayas. Conflicts around the world arised that weren't resolved starting after Koa Period 3. Also, for some reason, Lelouch doesn't seem to care about any of this. His apathy was just hand-waved in this series, which I'm not happy about. Real quick guys, if you're enjoying the video and finding value in this content, then please like the video, share the video, and subscribe to the channel. I've got plenty of more videos covering Roze Recapture in the works and bigger plans for the future of this channel, but to make those happen, I need your support. Now let's get back to going over why Ash's death was one of the dumbest things in this entire series, and that's saying something. Let's go over what happened from episode 9 to episode 12 to further provide evidence for this theory. Norland became the enemy of the world after launching the Roombas. Everyone rallied together to fight him, including Neo Britannia. The hatred of the world has formed around him. Sounds familiar? To stop him, Ash had to sacrifice his life. Norland smiled before he died, which could imply that dying was part of the plan. Then Ash blows up with him. Sakuya then wails over his death. This is followed by Kaguya narrating how the world has changed after Norland's defeat. And then, in the final scene of the series, Sakuya name drops Ash so theory crafters can figure out how he could still be alive. Does any of that sound familiar to you? Well, a lot of this is quite similar to what happened in the Zero Requiem. Lelouch became the enemy of the world, ruling it under the fear of Flayas. Everyone united against him. Suzaku sacrificed his identity to become Zero. They killed Lelouch as part of Lelouch's sacrifice. Nully wailed after Lelouch died. The world experienced a time of peace following that sacrifice. Colin narrates what's been going on since. We see a montage of everyone's lives during the epilogue, and C2 in the very last scene drops Lelouch's name, which was also used by theory crafters in their attempts to prove that Lelouch is still alive. Now, of course, I acknowledge that these two situations aren't one for one the same. For instance, Lelouch's plan involved uniting everyone against him to gather the hatred of the world in one place. Norland just wanted to exterminate all of humanity, regardless if they unite against him or not. But ignoring the obvious similarities is being willfully ignorant. The thing is, if Roze Recapture was mostly an original story and wasn't repurposing so much content from the original anime, then I wouldn't be as upset here. However, we know that's not the case. From episode 1, this series has been doing this, so Roze of the Recapture has lost any benefit of the doubt I had for it. So just remember, the only reason I think they killed Ash was to facilitate the process of undoing the Zero Requiem to replace it with their own, and of course to keep this trend going. Now that you understand the messed up motivations for killing Ash, we can then turn to how they handled his death from a writing perspective. Another failure. They wanted so badly to create their own Zero Requiem, but didn't have the writing chops to make it happen. So here's the setup for the scene. Norland uses his Geffion Disturber beam on the Z Apollo, which drained its energy filler. This required Sakuya to rescue him and then transfer the energy from her nightmare frame to his. That's the setup. Then we learn from Ash after Norland's defeat that if they continue sharing energy, they can't get back to the surface. That's why he disconnected from the Z Artemis and ultimately blew up with Norland. Also, Ash detached from the Z Artemis so Sakuya didn't get caught up in that explosion. The problem here is there's no setup for Ash's reveal. The characters don't talk about the potential consequences of sharing energy between nightmare frames. They also don't discuss what Norland might do after they defeat him. Instead, Ash reveals everything after the fact. Now you can argue that Ash didn't bring this up earlier because maybe Sakuya wouldn't have gone through with the mission, but that doesn't work for several reasons. If Sakuya can transfer energy to the Z Apollo, then she can monitor it from her end, meaning she knows they have less operational energy than normal. She doesn't need Ash to tell her this. I highly doubt that Sakuya doesn't understand the issues of transferring energy between nightmare frames, but yet doesn't bring it up as a potential reason to not do this. Also, if Ash had brought up the bomb issue earlier, Sakuya could have worked around it during the planning phase. By not incorporating this situation before the fighting starts, it ruins the tension of the scene. It also adds a contrived element to it. If Ash and Sakuya defeated Norland a few minutes earlier, then Ash doesn't have to die. If they defeat him a few minutes later, then both of them have to die. That's why the characters should have discussed this before fighting Norland. This time limit was a key factor in the battle, and thus it was vital to include it in this part of the story. So while Sakuya is counting down the amount of seconds for Norland's beams to cool down, she would also be monitoring the energy filler gauge, maybe even scanning for a bomb. But of course, none of this happens. It also would have made the payoff at the end satisfying instead of confusing and out of place. One counter argument you can make is that the audience can put the pieces together themselves to make sense of this. And maybe you could, but that's not your job, as it defeats the purpose of storytelling to begin with. I am so sick and tired of people calling my requests for basic information like this spoon feeding. If you can't tell the difference between Charles' long drawn-out expositional dialogue explaining the Ragnarok connection and Cecile telling Suzaku that the float unit uses more energy so he needs to watch his operational time, then maybe you need to reconsider how you analyze media. Now let's look at how the original anime did a better job of handling a similar situation. By the way, whenever I do something like this, defenders of this series respond with, well, this isn't the original anime. But I hate this counter argument because I am not referencing the original anime because I want Roze to be an exact copy. Quite the opposite, in fact. The problem with this anime is that it's too much like the original. Rather, I reference the original anime to showcase a positive example of doing something right within the same IP. I could easily reference another anime, but I used the original anime instead because it already set the precedent that all series in this IP should have lived up to, but in the case of Roze, it didn't. I hate how people can just hand wave these problems problems away, even though the same IP they like has never been this bad. To quote Wolf from EFAP, that just spits in the face of every single good story ever written. Because if you can just make everything good just by ignoring everything bad, then what's the point of ever making something good? Also, on a different but related point, there's this interesting dichotomy where the writers seem to only incorporate the failures from the original anime and not its successes. Examples include copying the last-minute nature of the Ragnarok connection with the Roomba plan, doubling down on the fan service, having too many characters, providing even less explanation for things, which ruins the world building of the series, and so forth. It's been over a decade since that anime came out, so why haven't they learned from those mistakes? You can't defend this crap anymore. It's almost like the writers behind this show don't understand or care to understand why the original anime worked. So now to the better example. In episode 20 of R1, Suzaku heads out to face Kawasaki and his army of Chinese nightmare frames. Before Suzaku heads out to battle in his Lancelot flight enabled version, Cecile warns him that his float unit consumes energy at a higher rate, so he needs to pay attention to his operational time limit. In other words, watch the gas tank. This creates tension in the episode because not only does Suzaku have to stop Kawasaki's invasion of Japan, but now has a time limit in which to do it. This forced Suzaku to land earlier during the mission to handle the ground forces instead of taking them out by air. Eventually he loses his float unit and sees that the energy filler is almost empty. Later on, during his conversation with Euphemia, Suzaku's final request to her is to lie about his upcoming death, and then his energy filler runs out. And even before this, we see Suzaku trying his best to fight against insurmountable odds. Of course, Suzaku doesn't die, as Lelouch saved him in the Gwain. What makes this work so well is that they set up the issue with the energy filler before he went out to battle, and the payoff is Yuffie's confession and Lelouch saving him at the last second. Now imagine if this followed the Roze approach and only brought up the energy filler issue right before Lelouch saved him. It would have ruined the scene, and that's what happened here. If you want to have this emotional payoff, then you need to have the appropriate setup. I think the reason why they didn't have the characters discuss this is because Roze and Ash would have altered their plans so neither one has to die. So they ultimately character assassinated both of them just to facilitate this terrible ending. This leads to the main complaint that Ash didn't have to die from a narrative standpoint. Let's go over reasonable ways that Ash should have survived. These are things that have been established and utilize Sakuya's skill set. I have two solutions. One involves altering the setup of the fight, and the other involves working within the terrible setup. Solution 1. Return to the 7 shining stars to refill the Z Apollo's energy and do any last minute preparations. This includes figuring out a solution for the bomb or how to prepare for a scenario if they have to eject from the nightmare frames in an emergency. The problem with their fight against Norlon is that it lacks tension. Gino said they have 3 days, not 3 hours, not 3 minutes, but 3 days before the Loki wipe out their forces. I don't think that's even true when Colin and Suzaku exist, but whatever. I will discuss the failures of the cameos in another video. Anyways, this lack of tension means that Ash and Sakuya can spend hours to refill their energy, put on spacesuits, or do any other last minute preparations before the final battle. Norlon isn't going anywhere, and based on his previous actions isn't going to stop Ash and Sakuya from leaving the battlefield. He didn't kill them despite having so many opportunities to do so. This is another example of them not learning from the past writing mistakes. In this case, it's copying the stupidity behind turn 10 where Colin decided to fight Shinkai before the Gurren flight enabled version received a brand new energy filler. In both situations, they didn't have to fight the boss right away and had time to prepare. In their infinite wisdom, they did a terrible job at recreating the same tension during the Zero Requiem. Lelouch had to stop Schneider's Schneisel now because he was going to launch the flares around the world. The longer he takes to stop Schneisel, the harder it's going to be. Also, if Schneisel reaches a certain point in the atmosphere with the Damocles, then even the Nightmare Frames can't reach him. The same time limit applies to his fight against Charles. If he doesn't confront him then and there in C's world, then the Ragnarok connection occurs and it's game over. The problem here is that Norland has already started the Roomba connection before the final battle. Besides preventing more casualties, there aren't any significant consequences if they took time to prepare before fighting Norland. This proves once again that Ash and Sakuya could have spent their time preparing before heading out to fight Norland. Okay, let's move on to Solution 2, where I discuss how Ash can survive while working with the current setup, no alterations. If Ash knows that Norland will self-destruct following his death, then getting away from Norland should be a priority. Ash should tell Sakuya to help him release the Foulbout from the /Harkins, then detach from the Z Artemis. He will then fall in a different direction, allowing Sakuya to catch him immediately, and then both can fly back to the surface. I didn't get the impression that the /Harkins were jammed in the Foulbout. If they were, Ash can cut the cords with his blades after removing them from the Foulbout's cockpit. There was enough time for Ash to do this before the bomb went off. Ash could also have ejected from the Z Apollo using the ejection block, since all Nightmare Frames have them. In the original anime, Cecile mentioned that the Lancelot didn't have an ejection block. By the way, this was a nice setup for an awesome payoff later on in the anime. In this case, they never stated that the Z Apollo didn't have an ejection block, so I assume it did have one. We even see other Nightmare Frames using one in the anime. I also figured that Arnold must have had one, otherwise how did he survive? And above all else, Ash should have communicated the issues with the energy sharing and the bomb during the fight. This would have given Sakuya more time to figure out a way to save Ash and of course herself. Oh, and for some reason they didn't turn off the Medusa Zeta after defeating Norland, which probably would have saved them some energy. You guys can probably think of even better ways to save Ash's life, so let me know your solutions in the comment section below. I think it's so typical that they killed off the character in this series with the most development. And just remember, they sacrificed Ash on this demonic altar to create their own Zero Requiem. I think the combined fan service of Catherine, Yoko, Haruka, and Sakuya has created so much brain rot in the Japanese fan base that they literally can't see the garbage that's right in front of them. I am ashamed to say that the brain rot has infected the global audience as well, but at least they are smart enough to notice that this part of the story was horrible. At this point, I don't know how anyone can justify this series as a good entry in the Code Geass IP. Take away the fan service, all of the recapture moments, and what do you have at the end? Some awesome Nightmare Frame action, paper-thin characters, a plot that ended before it started, terrible world building, and a plot to kill all of humanity with human blending machines. Ash deserved better, and so did the fans of Code Geass.